Okay, so I had a question about getting smooth transitions with my technique, so I'll try and um, address that as well as I can here. Obviously, I'm working with acrylic on watercolor paper, so if you're working on illustration board, there's a definite difference. Illustration board tends to really suck the pigment in really quickly, and you don't have a whole lot of time to kind of manipulate it on the surface. That's one reason why I like watercolor paper. Also, if you're painting really thick on watercolor paper with something like acrylic, be aware that that's obviously going to affect the qualities of the surface, and they won't be as absorbent. So those things come into play. So here's, obviously there's going to be a wet on wet technique, and I'm thinning my paint out with water, so it's fairly thin. I work in thin washes that I slowly build up, and that's another thing to acknowledge is I never get a smooth transition on like the first or second or third try. It's always this multiple layering effect to achieve the look that I want, and sometimes it takes longer than I wish, but if you're going for a certain effect, then I say take as long as is necessary to achieve that. Always practice, always experiment with different things. I probably don't experiment as much as I should. Anyways, so obvious wet on wet. You could use, instead of water, you could use a really thin tint of some color. And I'm just using like a Prussian blue for this demo. I always start at the top. Usually, if you can hold your paper to let gravity kind of work with you. Follow the bead down. Now, if you were doing just a normal, like a wash around something, let's say you're painting a cylinder, and like I said, you'd start at the top and follow the bead down. This is why sometimes you'll see in perhaps some of my time-lapse videos that I'm kind of like turning the painting as I go, because I'm probably like following the bead of paint here, and as that wraps around something, it's easy for me, or beneficial I guess, to turn my paper depending on what direction I'm painting and taking gravity into account. So if I was painting some more complex shape, it'd be something like this. And if you try these two different techniques, you'll see a difference in granulation, which is how the pigment kind of settles into the little pockets on the paper. So, that may be how I start something. And if you're working on a larger scale, the paint reacts a little different if you're applying it in really large washes. Sometimes the granulation gets a little heavier. It's all about experimenting. So if I wanted to do something like this, but I didn't want some of these crisp edges, perhaps if I wanted it to bleed off on the top and left side into softer forms, I would apply a little bit of water, and you don't want that super wet. You want it to have just a little bit of sheen on it. Well, I guess that depends on the effect you want as well. So, you can fade that out. Also, you can incorporate a lot of different techniques to get an effect. While this is happening, um, if it's bleeding out too much, obviously you can start to lift out the pigment and control that to an extent. Even down here a bit to lighten things up, or get a clean brush with just water and remove some of the pigment this way. This can get tricky because the pigment's obviously saturating the paper and is starting to dry and become more permanent. See, that's not really moving at all right there. So that's time sensitive, and sometimes that's a bit stressful, but that's one way to do things. Now here, as it started to dry, you know, my brush strokes are becoming a little more apparent, and this is more of a scumbling kind of dry brush effect. And the key to this technique is you want very little pigment on your brush so that you can scumble. And this is it's very similar to shading with a pencil. You apply a little more pressure, and hopefully that's not too subtle, but it's all part of the building up process. So if I wanted to use the scumbling technique, over this, obviously I would load up the brush a little bit and start to build up the value and color on whatever the figure is you're working on. This is kind of a tedious process, but if you're working around your painting, it also dries pretty quick, so we'll go back over it soon after. Eventually, depending on how dark you want to go, you might switch to a different density. Now that's actually still a little bit damp, but like I said, there's plenty of techniques to use. When I'm scumbling, it's kind of like cross hatching in a way. It's like a very subtle cross hatching. So, things to be aware of if if you're doing like a wet on wet technique, and you want some granulation on purpose, you know, you can get a heavy granulation. You can already see that some of this paint is settling, you know, fairly heavy and kind of spotted. Something to keep in mind is that with the scumbling or dry brushing technique, perhaps you could call it glazing as well, is you're physically kind of spreading the pigment thin as you go versus letting it settle like this. Like I said, you can mix and match all these different techniques, obviously, but you know, so I might start off something like this, and it might have granulation heavier than I want. When it dries, I'll go back in and smooth it out with some dry brushing, or some, you know, flat washes, like I did here. But I tend to work pretty thin. So, like I said earlier, you know, do a lot of experimentation. It's all about practice. Sometimes, you know, if your paint gets too thick and you try doing some wet on wet with some really thick paint, it's obviously going to react very different. But you know, those are all things you can experiment with, and you might like, you know, what you see, and be able to utilize that in some fashion. But really, it just takes a lot of time, personally speaking. But that is essentially how I work. You know, you know, like if I was working on a larger painting, say, and I wanted to tone the entire board, because I know it's going to look a certain way, or have a blue cast to it, I might put a wash over the entire thing. And, you know, I might have a figure in the middle, or, you know, whatever I want to not be too effective. So, you know, obviously I would do that, and while it's still nice and wet, get my paper towel and, you know, pull out whatever things I wanted to pull out, to get that effect. And I would do that probably several times to build up the background. You know, and it's mostly because this is so small that it's easier to work with. But you know, while that's happening, I could potentially, say if that was a sky or something. I don't know, this all seems basic, but you never know. Hopefully this might help someone. You know, you could start to darken at the top, and you know, get your transition. But you know, ultimately for me, I will do that multiple times to get the effect that I want. Mostly when I'm doing details and stuff, it's a lot of the kind of like hatchy dry brush technique that I was doing here to get form on, and I can be really anal, so this is a bit rough, but you know, even then, some of these rough marks, you know, I can go in and smooth those out, fix things up. like I said, I never nail anything. It's always this slow kind of like um, building up towards what I want. Another thing to consider is, these are obviously very transparent washes, but you can start to mix and match with various opacities. Just be aware that you can start to get some chalkiness if you start painting opaquely over stuff. I tend to use opaque paint for mostly highlights and stuff like that. Let me bring out, here's an old painting that I finished a while, years ago. And, so I would have used a big wash over the entire thing, and with my paper towel pulled out the figure and the moon. That's how I would have started this. Slowly building out the background and the sky. The stars, they're all opaque. These crispy highlights on the arm, around the hair. Those are opaque. It's easy to do, lines and stuff like that. But mostly, the moon, the shirt, all these other lighted areas are basically the paper showing through. Now here, I did, basically block this shape in his pants, very dark, basically black. But then I mixed a kind of neutral purplish tone and opaquely applied in some of these highlights. With a shape like that, you just need to suggest a few things. A lot of the detail, kind of falls into shadow. So that would be an example of, using more opaque application. It's more efficient and, save a lot of time. But, a lot of the scumbling technique is what I fall back on. So hopefully that helps. Thanks for the question.